Documentary is at its fourth film festival this weekend in New Jersey, the New Jersey Recovery Film Festival. So it's making the rounds, and I think it'll be in distribution later this year. So it's a really exciting documentary. So thanks very much. And welcome, everybody. I'm David. The way we format these is that I usually bring a topic, and I have tonight, talk about it for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we can talk about the topic, or we can talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. Is this the general idea here is addiction Q&A. So wherever we want to go, we'll go as long as I can speak a little bit about it. I'm happy to share. But the theme tonight that I want to talk about is honesty, and honesty in recovery. And I think it's something that is a really important aspect that sometimes people are so busy trying to deal with cues and triggers and stopping the behavior and really kind of avoiding the wreckage of addiction on their partners sometimes and on themselves, that we don't emphasize, I think, honesty enough. I think in the S programs and the sex programs, there's a lot, maybe more on that because of the element of disclosure to partners. But I think when you get into substance addiction, it usually involves the person themselves, and there's not the emphasis on disclosure for partners. But I want to talk about all that in general tonight, and then we'll just see where we go. But first I want to say that the fuel for addiction is lying, right? The opposite of honesty is dishonesty and lying. And that really is one of the critical elements to keep an addiction alive. And so I think it's really essential that we address it in a straightforward manner. And I think I would even go further to say that lying can be a relapse trigger, or is a relapse trigger. So even if someone isn't acting out, or even if someone isn't using their drugs, if they still find themselves lying, that kind of behavior, because it's such an addictive mindset, really can lead to triggers and cravings and a lot of trouble. So if you think about an addict has to lie about getting their drugs, using it, acting out, hiding the consequences, planning the next relapse, there's a lot of secrecy and lying that go into it. And I think some of us addicts wouldn't necessarily call it lying at first. We might have other nicer words for it, more polite words, but it's basically lying in the end. So I think it's something that the addict has to really face for a while. But the issue here is that an addict, over the course of their career, they get really good at lying. And I might say a lot of us, and I'm an addict in recovery, before I ever picked up a drug, I was really good at compartmentalizing. So I would, and it wasn't lying per se, but I was able to take issue A and put it on the shelf over here and not let it bother me and deal with issue B. And my life was kind of these compartments, and that really facilitates that kind of lying. So one of the things in recovery, I think, is to really get rid of those compartments, break down those walls, and really open it up. So lying takes a toll. It takes a toll not only in recovery, but it really traps you in addiction. And the consequence of all this lying is that it causes a lot of emotional discomfort, which fuels the need to escape. So it's part of it's a really integrated part of the cycle of relapse and addiction. And so how does this all translate in recovery? We know that in recovery, it requires complete honesty, because really lying destroys relationships with oneself, with other people. And I think it's really important, essential for an addict to be as honest as they can be with the people that are involved in their recovery. And this can be families, and we'll talk more about disclosure in a minute. But I'm thinking of doctors, 12-step peers, sponsors, therapists, people that really need to know everything. And I think, the reason they need to know everything is because it keeps the addict accountable. And I think that's really an essential aspect of recovery, is that the willingness to open up and be honest. And I think one of the problems here is that people don't really know kind of how to be honest as an instinct. I think the addicts are in such a habit of lying and kind of covering their tracks that it becomes almost second nature. And I think it really takes time to kind of switch gears and retrain the brain to really be as completely honest as we can. So I think that's really an incredibly important piece. I will say this, there's I think an aspect, sometimes I see it in newcomers especially, where they take this spoken need to be honest and kind of convert it into brutal honesty, what we call brutal honesty, right? So I see a pattern of people early in recovery to be honest about other people's flaws. Go up to somebody they heard share something and give them their honest feedback, and then say, well, I'm only being honest. But I think the issue there is that honesty is not about expressing our true feelings and taking other people's inventory. Honesty really is about us and what we're doing and what we believe, and how we can be honest about ourselves, not find what's wrong with other people or tell them how we think it should be done. So really, this whole emphasis on honesty is all about fixing us, the recovering addict. And I think if we don't do that, it's going to trap us in either an addictive cycle or in a place in recovery where people aren't really progressing the way they could or should. So as I say, it won't come naturally. I think I've had a lot of addicts, and it's true when I'm doing as a therapist. I put my therapist hat on. If I'm doing some work with someone for substance addiction, I'll do an assessment. The first time I get a picture, the second time I get a kind of a better picture, and the third time it's much more complete. And as there's a relationship, as there's trust, there's kind of this rolling disclosure of facts. And I think that's kind of sums up the process of kind of learning how to get honest in recovery. I think it's an issue of like, well, now that I think about it, it was more like this, kind of reshaping and really being as honest as we can. So that's really important. Just a word about disclosure. I think this, first of all, disclosure in general, not necessarily for sex addicts, but I think disclosure in general, and I do a lot of work with people living with HIV as well. It's the same phenomenon. A lot of people feel that they need, once they make a decision to get into recovery or to get tested and discover they're HIV positive or some other issue, they feel they kind of have to tell everybody. And I think in my experience, a lot of that is dealing with their own anxiety about how people might react. So they just kind of blurt it out to their boss, to their friends, to their peers, to the checkout woman at the grocery store, just kind of every answer. And it's inappropriate, really. And I think a lot of times people have a regret that they've done that. So I think the idea of disclosure is with, and I'm talking now not so much about partners, but peers in program, therapists, friends. What's the point of telling them? Can they benefit us, or is it just kind of to get it off our own chest and not so much for any kind of beneficial reason? So I always encourage people to slow down on the disclosure, because I think oftentimes it's just they kind of blurt it out, and oftentimes they'll have a lot of regrets. Once you say that you're a meth addict or living with HIV or a sex addict, no matter how kindly people are, they're going to look at you differently, and they just do. And I think that's an important thing to take into consideration. Now, I think in recovery, we can say, well, they need to look at me differently. They need to look at me as this different person. But I think it's not valuable for you or anybody else to have that news be out there in general. Now, for disclosure for sex addicts, I work with sex addicts in conjunction with Dr. Rob. This is not my primary area, but in general, I think, what are the elements of a good disclosure? First of all, I think, again, it shouldn't be done right away. There's a sort of this guideline about 90 days. I think sometimes it may take more, sometimes it may take less. But I think honesty has to be, when the disclosure is made, it has to be fully honest. This rolling disclosure idea just won't work, because the whole point of disclosure is to kind of heal the relationship, to repair the relationship. And if I'm holding back certain issues that may and will probably come to light later, it just does more harm than good. And I've seen that over and over again, where somebody will become kind of half clean with all the stuff that went on. They kind of, the relationship finds a balance, gets some footing again, and then something else comes out. And it just kind of destroys the whole process. So I think that idea of full honesty is really important. Now, that said, I think that going back to what I said about brutal honesty, I think sometimes every horrible detail doesn't have to be shared, because it can often be hurtful. So what kind of things do need to be shared? I think the types of behaviors that we saw, the time frames. So over the course of, like, how long has this been going on? When did this start? What happened? Any kind of health threats? Do I have STDs? Could I be at risk for Hep C or HIV? And anything that affects the partner, obviously, a health threat. Behavior with anybody that we might know as a couple. Who is this? Who was I involved with? And more to the point, who knows about this besides me? Because very oftentimes, I'm talking as the spouse often is the last to know about some of these things. So I think some of those are the elements that I see, and Scott probably will want to add something, but I think with that outline, that really makes an effective disclosure. And I think sometimes if we cover those categories of things, I don't know that we necessarily want to, or it's advantageous to talk about every horrible event. It's just not useful. So that's my plug for honesty, which is a rare commodity these days in general in our society. We can make our effort a day at a time with each of us. And so again, jump on if you have questions. Use the chat feature, and welcome any comments.
Yeah, I would encourage people ask questions. Via Q&A or chat. Also, if anybody is a sex addict out there listening today and you've given disclosure, maybe type a little bit in the Q&A feature, the chat feature, about what that was like, and anybody who has received disclosure from an addict, particularly sex addict. It would be interesting to hear people's experience with that, particularly on both sides.
Sure would.
David mentioned earlier disclosure, particularly with sex addicts. I mean, this is typically part of the therapeutic process with any sex addict who's in a relationship. It should always be facilitated by a therapist who's done this before and knows what he or she is doing. And usually the addict has a therapist and the partner has a therapist, and those are separate therapists. Typically, the betrayed partner will submit a list of questions that he or she wants answered. That will be passed from therapist to therapist and then to the addict. And as he or she writes out his disclosure document, letter, whatever it is, we'll be sure to answer those questions specifically. And David also mentioned the language you use is important. Use clinical terms. Avoid slang. There's, how many times, when it started, but, where it happened, if that's important. If you were having sex in your marriage bed, you probably need to mention that. If you were having unprotected sex, you probably need to mention that. And the purpose of disclosure, and there are multiple parts of disclosure. The addict gives disclosure, you kind of separate, you have a plan for what you're going to do afterward. And then the betrayed partner will usually write a letter based on that disclosure. Here's what I felt, here's what I learned, that kind of thing. And then that's, again, another session where everybody comes together and shares that. And then usually later there's another session where the addict kind of writes an amends letter. Like, I'm really sorry I made you feel this way. And it's more of an empathy exercise. I heard you, I heard the hurt in, what I've done to you. And it's very healing, but the primary purpose is to begin the process of rebuilding trust in a damaged relationship. And David mentioned, when you give disclosure, get it all out, because you've been dribbling it out for months and months or years sometimes. And every time you do that, your partner trusts you a little bit less. Even if you've stopped the bad behaviors, your partner trusts you a little bit less because you haven't come clean. Disclosure is your chance to come clean and get it over with, and not necessarily start from ground zero, because you're about 20 steps below ground zero, but to at least climb your way back up and begin the process of building trust. But 3 weeks later, your partner finds out something else. Guess what happens? It's all gone. So it looks like we have something in the Q&A here. How can an addict be honest when they are deep in denial? How can a partner help break through that denial? My husband continues with the addiction behavior, blame shifting, gaslighting, projecting, manipulation, even though he has stopped watching porn. He tells me he doesn't want to live in a PG world forever, referring to him having to avoid certain apps and websites.
Okay, well, when an addict is deep in denial, and many are, it's really difficult to break that spell. I mean, they're really kind of deep in a trance. They're in a spell. They're in a unreal world that full of rationalizations and denial and all kinds of cognitive errors, we'd say, sort of mistaken beliefs that kind of fuel this dysfunctional pattern. And when someone's in that, I question, first of all, whether a spouse can really be effective at breaking through that, because spouses can come off as just, there can be a lot of transference over to the spouse in just terms of transferring blame, shifting the blame, kind of saying, well, I wouldn't do it if I didn't get nagged so much. And it becomes a kind of an artifact in the relationship that I don't think is always helpful. In terms of the spouse trying to break through the denial. I think that's really best done with a group of peers or with a therapist, because that group has the power to really break through, to penetrate some of the denial. And I think if the denial system is really well constructed, and many are, it's usually going to take strong voices that are kind of corrective voices confronting, along with some kind of crisis, because I think it's the crisis that really makes the addict teachable in that moment. There's other ways it happens, of course, but I think that those are the common elements that kind of help crack that denial. And there's that moment of not clarity, but being teachable. And that's temporary in my experience. And that's why it's so important to catch an addict at the right moment when that kind of denial system is cracked. And that may be when they're in the remorse stage after acting out, or there's been some consequence and they're kind of feeling just horrible. Kind of fades as they start to feel better, or they get more sexually aroused, or whatever. So I think the denial comes and goes. So I think one thing the partner can do is to just give straight, honest feedback. You know, that this is, I don't, you know, that doesn't, that's not true. Statements like that, that doesn't match what I just saw. Because I think one of the things that partners are affected by is this kind of belief, like, my God, am I crazy? You know, it's kind of what we're seeing on the national news too. Like, we see stuff with our own lying eyes, right? We see stuff on TV, but the person denies it. It's like, this doesn't make, am I crazy? This doesn't match my reality. I think that's also, by the way, a very common phenomenon with children who grew up in dysfunctional homes, who kind of see the truth, but their parents tell them it's something different. And it's very confusing. It's confusing to a child. It's confusing to a partner. So I think it's really important to have the partner have their own resources in this as well. But I think, you know, to go back to the particular situation here, when I hear an addict talk about not wanting to live in a PG world and kind of making excuses, that certainly falls into denial. But I think there's that kind of there's a half measure there, a half-hearted commitment, but by not really embracing the full scope of recovery and what that would entail. And I think that's really hard to live with over time, because it's, as I mentioned before, any lying kind of keeps that addiction process alive and is actually a trigger. And I think lying, in the case of lying to oneself about, well, for example, I'll jump out of this case and give you another example. Clients I have, a lot of gay guys using apps on their phones, Grindr, Scruff, where they hook up and find drugs and sex. So people will be in recovery from addiction and methamphetamine addiction, but still go on the apps. And I've had so many clients say, just to see who's out there, just kind of to check out, you know, who's around. And it's like, really? That's that lying to oneself that can lead to addiction. And these are the slippery slopes, and really lies open up the gate to that. So, yeah, I just think sometimes partners take on the almost impossible task of being the warriors that kind of want to break through that denial. And I think it's frustrating for one thing. I'm not sure it's always the most effective way either. Scott, do you have thoughts on that? That's kind of shooting from the hip on that.
Yeah, no, I think you covered a lot of it. You know, as an addict, I can tell you that my denial had two parts: the lies I told you and convinced you to believe, or thought I convinced you to believe, and the lies I told myself and convinced myself to believe. And the latter ones, the lies I told myself, were far more damaging and far more difficult to overcome. You know, I had to lie to myself and ignore and rationalize and minimize and justify to make my life okay. And I had to believe those lies. You know, and it's just one lie built on another lie, built on another lie. And, you know, sometimes they start small and they seem kind of believable. But, you know, when you stack 14 of them in a row, you know, you've basically created this huge house of cards, and the wind is eventually going to blow and it's all going to come crashing down. You know, as addicts, we use super glue to hold those cards together. And it takes a lot. And David mentioned, you know, just honest feedback about facts. You know, you got home, you said you were going to be home at 7, you got home at 10:30, and then feelings. That makes me feel as if you might be blah, blah, blah. And your feelings, not anybody else's, not his or hers or whoever's, your own feelings. Facts as you perceive them, and feelings are, you know, that's the best feedback. And that's how therapists approach things. When therapists confront people, they just spit out a fact and you know, try to dig into the feelings. So yeah. But yeah, you covered it.
Okay. Yeah, you reminded me of, as a therapist, one of the great kind of STEM sentences I give to clients, I think is really useful. I use it in my own life, is when you do X, this is very similar to what you just said, Scott. When you do X, it makes me feel Y. You know, so when you don't come home for 3.5 hours when I expect you, it makes me feel anxious, worried, angry, whatever. But that kind of structure keeps everything in its lane, right? It keeps the focus on what the person has done behaviorally makes me feel a certain emotion. And it's a direct connection. It's irrefutable. It's just fact. So yeah.
And we got another, this is a follow-up to the initial question. I noticed one of his triggers is when he's feeling difficult emotions. Yes, that's a trigger for every addict that he doesn't want to deal with, and he starts wanting to go to porn for emotional soothing. Then he gets resentful and rationalizes why I am his energy. One of the very common forms of denial is blame. My partner does this.
Right.
If she didn't do this, I wouldn't need to do this.
Right. That's a really classic. And there's several classic things in this response. One being the uncomfortable feelings. You know, anybody who has experienced an addiction almost always starts that way, using some kind of addictive behavior or drug as medicine, as a way to soothe or to numb or to distance oneself from uncomfortable feelings, or to suppress or to augment, or it's a way to manipulate feelings, usually to kind of escape the feeling. And so when your addict husband, or when anybody for that matter, any addict has some emotional pain, their first tendency is going to be to go to that addictive behavior to cope. It's their primary coping mechanism. That's why one consideration I have as a therapist is I understand if I'm trying to get somebody clean and sober or sexually sober, I have to understand that's their primary coping mechanism. They're going to have to deal with life and all kinds of feelings that start to come up if I take that away. And so as quickly as we kind of confront and try to get rid of the addictive behavior, we have to give tools, we have to give support, we have to create a container in which the recovery can happen. And in a place like Seeking Integrity, where we have a residential component, we can do that. We can create a safe container where people can do the work. That can also happen in 12-step meetings to some extent, where that becomes your safe place where you can talk about it. So I think that ability to manage feelings in a healthy way is really critical for any addict to move past. And then, as Scott mentioned, blame, the idea of it's really hard for an addict to accept responsibility, and this, really, that's the essence of denial, right? It's like, I drank too much, because my dog didn't come as fast as I thought, or my boss looked at me cross-eyed, or I had a great day, so I couldn't deal with those happy emotions. I drank too much over that. We drank over almost any irregularity, right? And so I think it's really important to, an essential task for recovery is for the addict to take responsibility. And we as addicts now are solely responsible for what we've done to our lives. And I think the sooner we kind of recognize that, the better. Now, do most of us have trauma? Do most of us have childhood things? Yes. But I think the issue with recovery is that we maybe are not responsible for some of the things that happened to us as children, but we certainly are responsible for how we deal with them once we know we're an addict and have the tools to deal with them appropriately. So blame is not, that kind of blame raining down on a partner is not something they should or need to accept. It's not their responsibility in any way whatsoever.
Yeah, I agree with that. And for those of you who joined us late, our topic, in case you haven't figured it out, is honesty and recovery, both as an addict becoming honest and as a betrayed partner receiving honesty in a formal disclosure process. So if anybody has any questions about that or anything else, please ask them using the Q&A feature down near the bottom of your screen, or you can use the chat feature. The chat feature is a little less anonymous. I wanted to, since we're on sort of common forms of denial and dishonesty, one of the big ones I hear from sex addicts especially is, and I'll just assume the addict is male and heterosexual, is what she doesn't know can't hurt her. If she doesn't know, it's not a problem. And it's just not true. David, you want to talk about that? Or I have thoughts on it, but I'll turn it over to you for a minute.
Yeah, I think that's part of this delusional system that I'm doing my stuff. There's no consequences, no victim, no harm, no foul. And I think that really, of course, isn't true. The addict tells themselves that to make them feel better. But even if someone doesn't know exactly what's going on, I'm married for a long time. I know, there's something wrong, right? You may not know what it is, but I think for an addict to go around thinking they're really being sly and clever, I think is just, delusional, and that the partner knows something wrong. They may not know what, but I think there's definitely a sense things are not right. And that's where I think it plays mind games with the partner, because they can start to feel what, they've on themselves, right? That's a human nature thing for us to do, is that if something's wrong, we kind of take responsibility for ourselves, even if we can't quite know what's going on. Now, of course, there are times, especially with sex addiction, I think, where there's really shock and trauma that people discover this behavior has been going on a long time, for years sometimes. And that's totally, of course, it just, the ground drops out from under you. Your world is turned upside down. So certain behaviors can be kind of kept under wraps, perhaps, but I just guarantee the consequences and the feelings, the emotional consequences, cannot be. It's a toxic, sort of slow deterioration of the relationship.
Yeah, the emotional distance that addicts put between themselves and spouses, partners, children, parents, siblings, friends, it cannot be hidden. The other party in the relationship inevitably feels it. And it's particularly hurtful to spouses and partners and to children. Children, always assume their parents are perfect and take blame for, daddy doesn't pay as much attention to me anymore. Daddy missed my ball game. Where was he? The children always think it's their fault. And usually the spouse, particularly female spouses, will take some of that on. Have I gained weight? Am I no longer attractive? What am I doing wrong? Well, nothing. Nothing. But yeah, that emotional distance is a huge consequence, a huge relationship consequence that, as active addicts, and I can speak from this perspective, we don't think about that. We just don't want to get caught with our pants down. If we don't get caught with our pants down, we think we're doing all right, and we're really not. We're pushing people away, and we're destroying relationships that are very important.
And I would add to that, it's not as easy to identify sometimes, but there is an emotional distance happening within the addict, him or herself. Because I think through the addictive process, we start to lose touch with who we were, with ourselves, with our values, with things we said we would never do. And then we do it, and then we cross a line, and we cross that line, and cross that line again. And I think it just, suddenly we're not the people that we think we are, or that we started out. So I think there's this emotional distance on all sides, which is just destructive for everybody. It's just a general happy situation.
Yeah, that goes back to what I said earlier about the lies I told myself and believed were far more damaging long term than the bullshit I was feeding everyone else, because I didn't know who I was when I walked in to my first therapy session or 12-step meeting. I had no idea. That stopped when I started drinking and using and acting out when I was in middle school. No idea who I was as an adult. We have another question here. What are the most important questions to be asking a sex addict? I assume this is if you want honesty and full disclosure. So that's a very big question.
It sure is. And I guess it depends on at what phase you're at. I think if you're still at the kind of situation where the addict is not in recovery or is having a difficult time with recovery, I would use those kind of basic questions that Scott and I laid out before: observing behavior, expressing feelings, saying, gee, when you were late for 3.5 hours, it made me feel this. And kind of, you have a right to kind of have an explanation of that. So I think to clarify behavior, I think what we do as therapists is look for discrepancies and then kind of pick away at that to kind of break through the denial. Spouses can do that too, although I said oftentimes it backfires on the spouse, backfires on the therapist sometimes too, but the spouse can easily be blamed for that. Now, once in recovery, and that disclosure process that we talked about, I think that's where categories of questions have a right to be answered. And I had talked about some of those before: the types of behaviors, the time frames, the health issues, their health impact, who is involved, where, who else knows about this. Those kind of things I think are essential as part of disclosure process to be carefully managed. And I really want to emphasize what Scott said earlier, in that this is not something to be blurted out over the second cup of coffee at the breakfast table. This is a really formal process that takes weeks and months of preparation on the parts of both parties, with professional assistance and guidance on both sides, to really have this thing be effective. It's a critical element of recovery, because, as we said, that honesty as a foundation really provides the platform for healing and growth of the relationship, or not. And I think it's really essential that it's be done properly and with a lot of care. And the word I haven't mentioned tonight that came to me, and I should have talked about it before, but an essential element of all this is empathy. And I think empathy, of course, I define as the ability to just feel someone else's feelings, right? And as human beings, we're hardwired to do that. We have these mirror neurons, and we can connect with people, and basically most people can sense what other people are feeling. And that's not necessarily helpful for an addict. If they are too aware or to the emotions of people who they're impacting, that's problematic. So I think a lot of times addicts will pull back. It's a really interesting study. Just a footnote here with methamphetamine users. Chemically, meth affects their brain so that they can't actually recognize emotions on faces. It can be a happy face, a sad face, an angry face, a scared face. A meth addict over time will just see anger. And so addicts really do. There are some brain differences that affect our ability to empathize. But empathy is the critical piece here for the addict to understand the impact they've had on their partners, on their children, on their lives, and to really own that in a way. And one of the most worrisome things for me as a therapist in treatment is if I see somebody who really is incapable of that empathy. And you can feel it, by the way. Even if they haven't said the words, I can feel if somebody is connecting with emotions of other people. And but if they're not, that can be sociopathy. It can be other dangerous things. But I think that piece to be able to empathize or to understand what other people are feeling is a critical piece of recovery and being a human being, for that matter.
I think addicts, if we had the ability to be empathy in our addiction, we squash it and we push it down, and we kind of have to relearn it, or some of us learn it for the first time. I honestly believe that I learned empathy in recovery, not as a child. It just was never modeled for me, and I didn't know how to do it. Somewhere along the way in recovery, and particularly in group therapy and 12-step meetings where people get really honest and other people feel and react, I kind of learned empathy. And I think somewhere about the 5-year mark, I realized that, I kind of feel empathy now automatically for other people. And it was a little disturbing, but also cool and a sign of progress. So yeah, empathy it's important. When you start to feel empathy on a regular basis, you're probably well on your way to recovery, lasting recovery, I would think. I also wanted to add something about, particularly with formal disclosure, but any time that information about an addiction is being shared with someone who's affected by it, whether it's in the beginning stages or later in recovery, safety first. And therapists are very, very, very big on safety first, particularly with disclosure. There are plans for, what are you going to do after disclosure? Are you both going to go back to the same house? Are you going to sleep apart? Most therapists will make you have a friend sit in the lobby while you're giving disclosure or receiving disclosure, and you will leave with that friend, not with your partner. You will go your separate ways for a couple days usually. This is why you should not do disclosure over coffee at the breakfast table. There's no support for either of you. And one of the reasons that disclosure is often put off, even though the betrayed partner usually wants to know everything right now, and naturally so, is the addict is not ready to give it. First of all, the addict has not gotten honest enough with himself or herself. So you're going to get a staggered disclosure, that would drip, drip, drip. And the addict doesn't have stable enough sobriety to stay sober after the emotionally gut-wrenching experience of telling the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. So, as David said, this is usually many weeks and sometimes many months go into getting the preparation for disclosure. And it's for the safety of both parties, because the betrayed partner really does need to get it all at once. And the addict really does need to be stable enough to give the disclosure and to give it honestly and fully without relapsing. So questions about, what to ask a sex addict, maybe the real question is when to ask a sex addict. And a lot of sex addicts will be advised by their therapist, when your partner wants to know X, Y, and Z, here's how you respond. I promise you, I will give you all of that information completely, honestly. I will answer any question you want answered, but let's please do it with the help of our therapists. So, please be patient with me. I promise I will give it to you. Thoughts, David?
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. I was just looking at the next question here. Yeah, I think that ability to be patient is one of the toughest things for a partner, for sure. And I think oftentimes because of the anxiety, especially if the denial has cracked and the sex addict wants to kind of make everything right, but they're not ready yet emotionally to handle it. I think it's frustrating for everybody, but I think it's really important to do it carefully. This is something that can be, a disclosure gone wrong can really be as damaging, if not worse, than a lot of the addictive behavior in the first place. And it's really, it's a very tender, critical point that has to be managed with a lot of care for everybody. And yeah, it's a complicated process, not something to be done shooting from the hip, for sure.
So the question David was just looking at, do you think the reason addicts lose the ability to feel empathy is because they know what they are doing is/could be hurtful to other people, so they stuffed it down? Like when you suppress shame, you end up suppressing things like joy, etc.
So that's interesting. I think definitely some addicts see the harm they're doing. Those that have maybe empathy in the first place, they understand they're having an impact. The problem with addiction, and this is a brain thing, it's not a morality thing, but addiction is a powerful pull in the brain, and it's more powerful than a lot of other things, including some human connections. And you can see addicts with the best of intentions saying, I'll never do that again. They believe it when they're saying it, but the pull of the addiction is so strong, it really makes that not possible. So I think people do understand they're having an impact, and they do to live with themselves. They kind of turn down that empathy, if you will. They kind of that's part of a denial system being built, and this is not a conscious process. This is a subconscious process for the most part. But they understand they're hurting people and they pull back. Now I think there are other people that may not have that heightened sense of empathy to start with, and I think oftentimes they're motivated just to not get caught. It's not so much about the impact of the other person, but it's like to not get busted. And I think so they pull back in that sense. And it's not so much out of concern for the impact on the partner, but for the fact that they don't want to have their addiction disrupted, the addictive patterns. And so I think there's many ways to get to that, but I think what we do see, the common phenomenon is that empathy levels are greatly reduced in addiction, and that impacts everybody. You said it's another important thing here at the end. When you suppress shame, you end up suppressing things like joy. This is a really critical point that I think it's subtle, but it's critical. And I think so many addicts don't get it because our world, when we're active, becomes kind of so black and white. We're in the addiction or in a latent period, and then we're acting out again. But when we start to turn down certain feelings and turn down the volume on them, we turn down everything. We can't pick and choose. Well, I'm going to really not feel the hurt that I'm causing my partner by doing what I'm doing, but go out and feel great joy or happiness when I do something else. It doesn't work that way. We kind of mute all our feelings. And I think that's a really terrible consequence of this process, is that it really robs both the addict and the partner, for that matter, of the ability to have a full range of emotional expression. Because on the addict side, they're trying to turn down uncomfortable feelings, and they're turning down everything. On the partner side, I think they're trying to protect themselves emotionally. If they're wide open for being hurt, for being scared, they turn that down too. They start to become defended. And those defenses really mute the full expression of all feelings for everybody. So it's a really kind of terrible consequence, and one that we don't talk about enough. So I really thank you for bringing it up, because it really does. Everything looks kind of gray and flat. And I think if you talk to an addict or a partner early on and ask them what they're feeling, it's just kind of feeling bad, or I'm not feeling anything. Excuse me. And I think the range of emotions and the ability to feel them really starts to grow and flower with some sustained recovery. But it's a long process. And I think that there's a kind of a sterility, emotional sterility to early recovery, simply because all those emotions have been kind of flattened by the process. Great comment.
Yeah, my goal as an addict was never to feel good. It was to feel nothing. And I succeeded. When I got into recovery, first year or two, I had the emotional range of, a teaspoon. It's just, there was just nothing there. And it has slowly come back. And, I was one of those people that I wasn't a meth addict, but I couldn't tell what other people were feeling. I couldn't read other people's faces. I couldn't read my own face. I didn't know what I was feeling. How can I know what you're feeling? And I had a little chart with like little emojis of faces smiling, and it had words like, disgust and happiness and shame and, under it. So I would try to identify, what was going on with me. I really had to go back to basics and learn this stuff, because I'd spent 25 years just torching all of that stuff. David, I was wondering, have they done any neurobiological studies related to empathy? Does a particular part of the brain light up? And if so, what is it, and how does that relate to the addiction parts of the brain?
Yeah, so we don't know nearly as much about empathy in the brain as we do about desire and dopamine and the reward circuitry and all that, which really is the fuel of addiction. But there's this other secondary consequence of empathy. It affects more the lateral parts of the brain on both sides. That's where a lot of the empathy centers are. And we just know they get kind of muted, and we don't know exactly how, what the neurochemical formula for that is, but they kind of, first of all, become muted, and they kind of go offline. And this is another thing we don't talk about maybe enough with the brain. We always talk about reward circuitry with the brain addiction, but there are other parts of the brain that are really affected by it as well. The two areas, one, the empathy centers we're talking about, which really get kind of muted, and the neural pathways that connect the empathy center to everything else kind of get frayed. And so empathy kind of gets detached. It's kind of floating around out there. The other area of the brain that gets really impacted by addiction is the frontal cortex, which is our higher brain. It's the part of our brain that allows us to make good judgments, to predict bad outcomes, to know right from wrong, to be less impulsive. All that kind of gets turned off. So an addict is really operating from just raw emotion. That part of the brain that is just, I feel good, I feel bad, or I feel something I don't want to feel. And it's really that primal. And I think these other kind of higher centers of the brain that make us human get really kind of turned down, including the empathy center. But to answer your question, Scott, and there's a lot of research that needs to be done still. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was curious about where empathy is located in the brain, and if it shared any of the pleasure pathways. It sounds like it doesn't.
To my knowledge, there's not a lot of overlap with those.
Yeah.
Okay. Like all parts of the brain, it's very complex, but it's connected to the hippocampus and other areas of the brain that have memories, and then contextual memories, like, gee, when this happened, it felt good, or when this happened, it felt bad. And those kind of things are all associated with empathy as well. But it's all very complex.
Okay. I have another question, and if anybody else has a question, please type it into the Q&A, and we'll get to it. In the interim, when I first went to therapy, when my life was first falling apart because of my many addictions, the therapist asked me why I was there, and I said, oh, I'm a little bit depressed. I'm not sure what's going on. And I never did tell him what was going on. how common is that, and why do we do it?
Um, well, I think it's extremely common. Um, my work with methamphetamine started out because I was a sex therapist. People came to me because they were having erectile issues and performance issues. They failed to mention that they were using, injecting meth 4 times a day, which causes that. But that was the real cause of it. So the presenting problem often isn't the whole story. And so I think that's a common phenomenon. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. One, people minimize out of shame because they're embarrassed. I think even the worst addict at some level knows what they're doing is wrong and is having an impact on people. That may not help them stop, but at some level, there's some awareness that at least other people would perceive this behavior and have some judgment about it. And so I think that's why we have these staggered or rolling disclosures where people gradually they figure if they give you a little bit at a time, it'll lessen the impact. So I think it's a common phenomenon. I think the driver for that, and I don't know if this is true in your case, but in the clients I've seen, and I think in my own recovery story, it was shame. I was embarrassed. Had a lot of shame about what I'd done, what I'd thought, what I fantasized about, what the impact it had. And I just part of the process of therapy is to take responsibility and own it myself, and to actually be in the presence of another person and share this stuff is really very extremely difficult, especially if we've been in the world in our head of rationalizations and justifications and all these things that as you say, when the wind came along, blew away. We're left with the wreckage, and the reality. And I think to actually say that out loud to someone is, first of all, a huge start toward healing, but it's a really difficult thing. And I think that's what keeps people from fully embracing it.
Yeah. I mean, in AA, there's a saying that I hear a lot: "We're only as sick as our secrets," and it really makes a lot of sense to me, because when I first started looking for some help because my life was a mess, I stayed as sick as my secrets. As long as I kept those secrets, I was still sick. And then, I see in all of my 12-step recovery programs, working with sponsees, that when they do step 4 and then, which is a searching and fearless moral inventory, and then step 5, which is when they share that information with, God and another human being, which is usually me, the relief that they feel once they unburden themselves of all of the lies and secrets. It's they always talk about, it's like I was carrying, a bag full of giant rocks uphill, and every time I let go of a secret, I dropped a rock. It's just, and for me, steps 4 and 5, and working in therapy with a recovery-oriented therapist who had basically was walking me through steps 4 and 5 piecemeal before I did them all at once. But every time I let go of something, I felt lighter and freer. And there was something reinforcing about, when I get honest, I feel better. When I keep secrets, I feel worse.
Right.
But it was still very hard to let go of, there was stuff I thought I'd take to my grave. And I'm not.
Yeah. I think that the power of healing, you can let go of something like that, is really tremendous. And in my own experience with those kind of things, it's like, why did I wait so long? Because I held on forever, that I thought, first of all, I didn't want people to know about me because I was ashamed. And then second, I thought, well, it's going to hurt people if I tell them. And that's where the idea of getting help with disclosure, I think, is really, but ultimately it's incredibly freeing. And also, I might add, secrets like that really affect not just our quality of life, but our physical life as well. And people don't live as long without that healthy connection, without being honest. there's all kinds of ramifications for that. So I think the ability to drop the rock is really important to lighten the load and to really move forward on recovery. There's another thing, at least they talk about in 12-step program, is I don't know if this is scientifically accurate, but if you have a problem, you tell someone, it's reduced by half. You tell another person, that's reduced by half. And you know, the scientists might argue with me, but I think we can all agree, and when I've done that at least, that's certainly true. It helps. It takes the relief off. You know, when I did a 4th and 5th step, I thought sure that my sponsor who I did it with, the 5th step, would like run screaming from the room, you know, that, oh my God. And just calmly sat there and kind of identified with some things, gave feedback, and just, it was very normalizing. And for me as an addict, that was tremendously healing because of the shame that I carried about it. It's not the whole story for healing from myself and my partner, but it certainly was an essential beginning for having some compassion for myself, and then allowing me to have compassion for others as well. Yeah.
Thank you, David. We're out of time. Do you want to say anything to take us out?
Just this whole idea of honesty. You'd think it would be second nature, but it's tough. It's tough for an addict, and I think it's something that everybody deserves. Partners and addicts, and our families and friends, and I think the world would be a better place. Not to be too trite at the end here, but if we had more honesty around. So yeah. So thanks everybody. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, David. Thanks everybody for attending. We'll see you next week.
All righty. Take care, Scott.
Bye.
Good night.